We all live in the world, and although we might try to avoid it, all of us do or buy things that produce climate-heating greenhouse gas emissions. So wouldn't it be great if we could just balance out our carbon sins by throwing money at the problem? Well, if you believe the fossil fuel industry and many major corporations, you can do exactly that with the power of offsets. I'm Ella, a climate scientist with a PhD in polar climate change. And here's a fun fact for you. For a brief moment in the pandemic, I was one of the very first employees of a tiny, teeny little wee startup, helping to develop a framework for evaluating the climate integrity of carbon offsets. That startup is now a major international company, B0 Carbon. And although I left 5 years ago to go back to academia full-time, I've stayed interested in the offsetting world. So in this video, we're going to find out, can we just offset our way to climate safety? Let's start with what we mean by offsetting. Offsetting allows someone doing a bad thing to balance out their bad vibes by paying someone else to do a good thing. You look like a bit of a... Yeah? Yeah. Hey, you look nice today. Like your eyes. Except in the real world, the vibes are actually measurable tons of greenhouse gases that contribute to the destruction of our environment and the acceleration of climate heating. So if you emit a ton of greenhouse gases from, say, flying somewhere, you can pay someone else to remove a ton of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, for instance, by planting a tree or restoring a natural habitat. That kind of offset is pretty easy to understand, and I'm going to call that a carbon removal offset. But you can also pay someone to not emit a ton of greenhouse gases that they otherwise would have emitted on your behalf. And I'm going to call that kind of offset an avoidance offset. So far, so good. But how do we know that a ton of carbon has actually been offset by a ton of carbon removal or avoidance? This is where it gets a bit tricky, and apologies in advance for the amount of jargony, markety words I'm about to throw at you. I promise they're important. Offsets are traded like any other commodity. The difference is that they're traded in carbon markets. Sellers sell a ton of carbon removal or avoidance, and then buyers can wipe a ton of emissions off their books. Typically, these buyers would be corporations looking to reduce their carbon footprint, and we'll get to why later. Essentially, what we want to know in that process is whether the offset is really worth the ton of carbon it claims to be. And establishing that really comes down to verification. How rigorously an offset's carbon reductions are verified depends a lot on where it's being traded. In the voluntary carbon market, which is where most offsets are traded, projects have to comply with a verified emissions reduction standard. Now, because there are so many, these standards vary, but typically to be registered as a verified tradable offset on the carbon market, projects require a third-party audit to ensure that a project is actually avoiding or removing the carbon that it says it is. And when an offset is bought, those carbon markets have to scratch it off the books to make sure the emissions reductions aren't counted twice. The standards vary in how rigorously they verify, but some of the biggest ones include Verified Carbon Standard, Gold Standard, and in North America, the Climate Action Reserve. When it comes to verifying the climate integrity of carbon offsets, there are a few metrics that really matter. One of the most important questions to ask is, would this have happened anyway? If you're paying someone to not emit a ton of greenhouse gases on your behalf, then you have to be pretty darn sure that they were definitely going to emit that ton of greenhouse gases before you got there. Because if they weren't, the offset isn't worth the paper it's printed on. If the offset produces some measurable carbon reduction through either avoidance or removal compared to the hypothetical scenario in which you didn't buy the offset, then we can say it is additional, as in this is an additional bit of carbon reduction that otherwise wouldn't have happened. I like your eyes. Oi, are you planning to be nice to her anyway? Nah. Hey, you look great today. I really like, your eyes. Are you planning to be nice to her anyway? practice, this can be really hard to gauge because there's no real counterfactual scenario. That is, there's no parallel universe that you can compare against where you didn't pay for the offset and the emissions actually did happen. It also relies on accurate emissions reporting and a lot of honesty, which in some cases is a big ask. In some ways, it can be easier to measure the additionality of removal offsets because it's usually unlikely that extra carbon would be removed on its own. It requires money, time, and effort to do so, so if someone's gone to the effort of removing it, it's usually a good sign that it wouldn't have happened otherwise. But for avoidance-type offsets, where you pay someone to not do something, like deforestation, it becomes important how much of that thing was happening without intervention, i.e. what's normal. Psst. Wait, don't you think she's a in it? We should totally tell her. No, you can't, because I've already been mean to them today. No. Here. The thing is, if you hype up the baseline for something that you then claim to avoid doing, then you can claim your credit actually avoids more carbon than it actually does. Well, actually, I was thinking that she's a proper f***ing stupid and also happens to be, and I'm definitely. No, seriously, you really can't, like. This technique of inflating the baseline of emissions produced by polluting activities is really common with avoided deforestation credits. In fact, in a recent assessment of offsetting projects traded on the voluntary carbon market, journalists found that the baseline scenarios of forest loss were exaggerated by 5 to 10 times, therefore allowing the projects to sell more carbon credits than they were actually generating. Just one more way that profits can be made for a few by exploiting the environment to the detriment of the rest of us. And on that note, one of the worst implications of the way offsets are traded in the free market is that they can sometimes create perverse incentives. What I mean by that is that it makes financial sense for project owners to actually emit more carbon to start with to raise the baseline of business as usual, because that then allows them to claim that they've reduced emissions by more than they really would have. So rather than just overhyping the baseline, they actually raise the baseline, which is obviously terrible for the climate. And then, of course, more emissions reductions means more money for the project owners. Win-win, right? Another problem with offsetting is permanence, or more specifically, non-permanence. This one is relatively self-explanatory. If an offset doesn't lock away carbon from the atmosphere permanently, then it isn't really offsetting emissions. And here, we use permanent to mean over human timescales, i.e. thousands of years. These are for you. I do need them back in 5 minutes, though. For example, if a project claims to be offsetting by not cutting trees down, or even planting trees, but then the next year they cut the trees down, then that's a non-permanent offset and it ain't worth the wood pulp it's printed on. If a non-permanent offset just means kicking the can down the road in time, then a leaky offset is just one that kicks the can across the road into the neighbour's garden. Oi, you're a Sometimes avoided emissions associated with an offsetting project result in emissions simply shifting elsewhere. So while emissions might be reduced in one location, they may simply be being emitted elsewhere instead. For instance, logging activities moving a few kilometres outside the boundary of a protected forest. Or even certain European countries claiming that their national emissions are falling whilst exporting all of their manufacturing to China. But I digress. There are a few main risks that can jeopardise the climate integrity of carbon offsets. First and foremost is the risk that an offset doesn't do anything valuable. This hinges on additionality. A non-additional offset is a worthless offset because the carbon reduction or avoidance would have happened anyway. We also worry about the risk of reversal when stored carbon is released back into the atmosphere or ocean. In other words, a non-permanent offset. This might happen because of human factors or by natural ones. For instance, if an earthquake destabilizes underground storage where captured carbon has been kept, or if a newly planted forest is burned in a wildfire, which of course is happening more often because of this whole climate change thing. The legal framework around offsetting can present a risk too, because if it's weak, then there are higher chances of reversal or non-additionality. For instance, weak governance or corruption can facilitate the inflation of baselines, misleading claims of additionality, or can fail to prevent activities that would make an offset non-permanent or leaky, like illegal logging. Many projects are located in the global south because most global north countries and companies would prefer to pay others to reduce emissions instead of doing it themselves. Lots of projects are therefore located in places with a history of weaker legal structures, higher instances of corruption, civil unrest and war which damage the environment, or economic conditions that push people to engage in illegal activities like logging. But if we zoom out and think about the bigger picture, there's another risk associated with offsetting too. Because offsets allow their buyers to claim carbon neutrality and environmental credibility, but there's rarely anyone actually checking up on whether those claims are valid. This is where we come back to the reason so many companies are starting to buy carbon offsets. When they buy carbon offsets, corporations can slap a big old carbon neutral label on a product. Have you ever booked a flight and seen the "do you want to offset your trip" option at checkout? Airlines are one of the biggest buyers of offsets because aviation is very difficult to decarbonize. And offsetting is their main strategy to reduce emissions from the sector as a whole. So much so that the aviation industry has launched its very own offsetting scheme to cut emissions and achieve, quote, carbon neutral growth. The shiny green image that this allows companies to present means they can sell more stuff or get away with other less environmentally friendly activities, which ultimately leads to more environmental and climate damage. And often, they're actually only offsetting the tip of the emissions iceberg, ignoring so-called Scope 3 emissions, which come from upstream and downstream activities like source materials and disposal. Those often account for the majority of a product's emissions because the direct emissions of, say, an office building or the energy used to run the business day to day can be easily reduced or offset. So if you're wondering why fossil fuel companies can still have net zero targets whilst indiscriminately hauling oil and gas out of the ground, that's why. In short, offsetting can be used to greenwash corporations or activities with net negative impacts on the planet. To counter this wild west of carbon-free marketeering, researchers from the University of Oxford have come up with a set of ideas called the Oxford Principles. They set out best practice when it comes to offsetting, and they look something like this. 1. Cut emissions as a priority and ensure the environmental integrity of credits. 2. Prefer removal offsets to balance residual emissions in line with net zero targets. 3. Use removal credits that won't be re-released into the atmosphere. And 4. Support joined-up approaches to net zero. Essentially, they say that cutting emissions should always be the priority. Offsets should be only used to balance out emissions that can't easily be prevented. And when they are used, offsets should have high environmental integrity, meaning they should actually be offsetting what they say they are, and should have a low risk of the carbon being accidentally re-released into the atmosphere. These are helpful guidelines, but they have no use unless they are actually enforced. And call me cynical, but I'd say that most of the time corporations are simply offsetting to increase sales, i.e. by paying lip service to environmental concern, outwardly showing their customers that they're committed to climate action, while actually doing very little that is impactful. To solve that, the UN has tried to implement a mechanism into the Paris Climate Agreement that tackles the trading of carbon directly. But Article 6, as is so memorably known, has proved one of the hardest additions to get agreement on at climate summits, dating all the way back to the Paris meeting in 2015. Under the UN scheme, countries could trade carbon offsets internationally to make up their national targets. The idea is that if one nation is so good at reducing carbon emissions that it overachieves its national targets, then it could sell some of those emissions reductions to another nation to make up its targets. Obviously, that assumes that some countries are going to be better than expected at reducing emissions, which is, to my mind, bold. But more generally, it's not clear how the UN's new carbon trading mechanism will impact the voluntary market, because they're kind of separate. At the moment, it's mostly corporate buyers who are trading offsets, with megacorps like Shell, Microsoft, and Delta historically topping the buyers' charts. But UN rules don't really apply here, and although the voluntary, i.e. corporate, offset schemes try to align with it, they don't have to. So UN rules apply to countries, while there's an entire other Wild West carbon-free market for companies. And here we kind of get to the crux of the problem. Offsets are a tradable, marketable commodity, so they get bought and sold. Sure, we live in an imperfect, capitalistic world in which economic incentives are king. I get that. But trying to wrestle environmental benefit or climate action into a neat, sellable package feels a bit like it's missing the point. Yes, it's better than nothing, but that's not to say the carbon market couldn't be a lot better. Ultimately, it comes down to quality, and there is a lot of crap out there. Where there's money to be made, there's an incentive to cut corners and sell cheap crap. And when it comes to offsets, forestry credits are where you find the most cowboys. A 2023 study covered by The Guardian found that 9 in 10 of the forestry credits on one of the voluntary marketplaces were junk. And a 2022 study showed that only small numbers of forestry projects actually lessen deforestation, with just 4 projects accounting for 3/4 of the overall reduction in deforestation. Further back in 2017, a report from the European Commission found that 85% of offsets under the UN's older trading scheme failed to reduce emissions at all. And these are not the only examples. Overall, there's a long way to go, and while high-quality offsets might be useful for some specific cases, they're not a panacea. Fundamentally, there's never going to be enough high-quality offsets to counteract our current emissions. Hell, there's not even enough low-quality offsets to counteract our current emissions. That means that the message remains the same. We need to cut emissions as a top priority. High-quality offsets can be used to balance out whatever carbon remains from essential industries that really cannot be decarbonized. Emphasis on the word quality. My personal take on it is that offsets shouldn't be used to counterbalance the environmental damage of industries or products that can mitigate their impact by reducing emissions or shifting production processes. It's a get-out-of-jail-free card for polluters who have the money to throw at the problem. And because the financial incentive and lack of market regulation drive the quality of openly traded carbon down, it's become a total racket. I won't say offsets are a distraction, but they shouldn't be the focus in climate action. The primary goal is still decarbonising and cutting emissions. Good offsets are a last resort to mop up those stubborn residual emissions from truly essential industries that can't be decarbonised. There's only one real solution to the climate crisis. So I'm going to say the same thing I say every time.
Same thing we do every night, Pinky.
Cut emissions. We need to cut emissions. That's it. This video was pretty technical and required quite a lot of research, so it took a really long time to put together. But that's only possible because of the support of my amazing patrons. And if you value the work I do, please do consider joining them over here. You can subscribe for just the price of a coffee each month, and it allows me to spend more hours working on these videos. If you can't chip in just now, then liking, commenting, and sharing these videos with friends really helps too. And of course, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Watch this one next about the hidden climate costs of aviation, one of the industries with the biggest investment in carbon offsets. And I'll catch you next time.